Well, our guest today is the chair of the School of Music, Richard Karpen, esteemed composer of contemporary music. And I've informed him kind of what we do in terms of the fact that we like to hear people's journey, their life in music and how they started. And because as we've all learned, it's for most of us a rather circuitous route, zigzagging all over the place between disappointment and success and expectations unfulfilled and things we never dreamed would happen to us. So Richard, tell us a little bit about your life in music, if you would.
Sure. So I'm going to start at a middle point, and then we go backwards and then forwards, because it's something I want to remember from a group of students in the prospective students in the arts that the different directors of the arts departments got together, and there's a class that's taught for students who are interested in the arts. And after talking about our backgrounds and the different kinds of ways that we came up as artists, and you'll hear a little bit about mine, we took some questions and answers, and a question from one young student was, what should he prepare to do if he wants to have a career as an artist? And I immediately said, prepare to clean toilets. And I mean that quite literally. So let's go backwards now, and I'll tell you how I got to clean toilets to become an artist. So I was born in New York in the late 50s. And when I was pretty young, moved to the suburbs and was back and forth between New York City and the suburbs. My parents are from Brooklyn, from way, way back. And I'm from a really literally blue collar background. That is, my father wore a blue shirt to work. One of the different jobs, he had lots of different jobs, but the job he held the longest was a furnace repair person. And I worked with him when I was a kid, and that meant going into basements of all different kinds of people. Very, very wealthy people in their big basements, and and almost ghetto kind of experiences into basements, and coming out covered in soot. So kind of like a chimney sweep up your face and all in your body and everything. So grew up in that kind of environment. But I also grew up at a time in public schools, and that music was something that happened in public school, and art happened in public school. So besides music, we did things like got on the bus and took a field trip to the Guggenheim Museum and saw paintings and things like that, just all us working class kids. But we were taught to read and write music, and I sang in the choirs, and it didn't matter what the music was that we were singing. We sang Christmas music, sang Passover music, whatever, because it was a whole eclectic group of kids from all different kinds of backgrounds, and we all sang. And I learned maybe once a week we wrote notes down. They actually taught us how to write down music in elementary school. I'm not talking about junior high school, no, elementary school. We learned how to write down music. And I also come from probably from a culture in a way where my grandmother made my mother get a piano in the house eventually. So there was a piano in the house. And I taught myself how to play the piano. I'm not going to go through all the details. I'll try to go as quickly. Then you could ask questions. And so I taught myself how to play piano. And one day, apparently, somebody was visiting the house and heard me playing piano. And they said to my mother, "Oh, so you're giving Richard piano lessons." And they weren't. And then I got some piano lessons. It was just an old upright piano. And I was teaching myself to play Debussy, of all things, because I didn't know I wasn't supposed to play that yet, but I liked it. So that's really how I got my start in music. At the same time, like any normal, I would say normal kid, I was also listening to a lot of rock music, of course, in the 60s. And I think that by the time I was a young teenager, I was just had a constant diet of Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, Jethro, and Beethoven and Rachmaninoff. I would listen to the Rachmaninoff Piano Concerto No. 2 over and over and over and over again. And then I would switch to the Madford Symphony by Key, and then I would shift to something by Blood Rock, or by or Dazed and Confused by Led Zeppelin, and listen to all those at the same time. And somehow by the time I was in high school, I knew I was a composer. Don't know why. I'm sure you've heard this story before. Why are you a musician? Why are you playing this? That's what I did. But like a lot of other composers, I was also very good in math. It's the brain, it's how the things work. Probably learning all that music when I was a kid. Probably helped me do math. I think it's more that than the other way around, actually, now from our vantage point. So I did a lot of math, I did a lot of music, and I hated school. So I finished high school, and my wife finished high school, we met in high school, and with no money, she comes from an even more, let's say, even a less affluent family than my chimney sweep family. We worked during the summer and we went off to Paris for a year with no money. We would be called illegal or undocumented in Paris under our current things, because we stayed, we didn't have a visa to stay, we just went. We didn't have any clue what we were doing, we just went. And we found a place to live, a little apartment, a room, not an apartment, a room. And this is the beginning of my sort of picaresque journey, where I meet people, sort of like David Copperfield-esque. So I knew a girl who played trumpet in the high school band. I play trombone. I'm not a trombonist, but I'll just freeform here for a little while. When I was in high school, I wanted to learn how to play flute because I liked Jethro Tull. And I went to the band director and I said, could I borrow a flute? Because I couldn't afford to buy one. He said, I'll lend you a flute if you learn how to play trombone, because he needed trombones in the band. So I said, sure. So I learned how to play trombone, taught myself flute, and met this girl in band, and her father worked for IBM, which is a big company back then. And when we went to Paris, her father was transferred to Paris, and I looked them up, and they knew a family that needed someone to take care of their kids. So my wife and I moved into their basement and took care of their kids in this very, very exclusive part of Paris. And I ended up getting a job sort of as a do-everything person for a family whose, the guy was one of the producers from this big movie that made a lot of money in the 1960s, A Man and a Woman, if you know that film, Tim. So turns out that the woman of the family was a singer, this is just by chance, and was singing some Schoenberg. I told her I was a composer, and she got me a meeting with one of the great composers of her generation in France, Betsy Jolas, who then became from Olivier Messiaen as the head composer at the Paris Conservatory. And I went to her apartment and showed her a string quartet I had written. I just by chance, this is all by chance. I didn't know who she was, but I could tell she was important. And she looked over my string quartet and she said it reminded her a little bit of Hindemith. And I was crushed because I hated Hindemith. I thought it sounded like Bartok. I like Bartok. And she invited me to attend her classes at the Paris Conservatory, just for free, just to drop in, which I did. And they were studying Schubert. And it wasn't because I didn't understand French that I didn't understand a word of what was going on. I couldn't understand the musical context that they were talking about. And I was very arrogant and I thought I knew everything. And I've been in touch with Betsy. She's in her 90s recently, and reminded her of this time in 1975 when she put me in my place, and I figured out that I needed to go learn. So eventually returned to New York, found a composition, still didn't want to go to school, found a composition teacher and a piano teacher. And the composition teacher was a Romanian escapee at the time in which you had to escape from Romania. Really wonderful composer and teacher who was a taskmaster, and who I ended up going through kind of French conservatory training, which means like 16-part double choir counterpoint. So I'd have 2 lessons a week. One was harmony and counterpoint, and the other one was my own music. And he would do that. So the days I had my own music, I'd bring a piece I was working on. Let's say I'm working on an orchestra piece. He'd put it on the piano and he'd say, play it. So not only was I supposed to play the orchestra piece that I was working on, but when I got to the last measure I had worked on so far and stopped, he said, why are you stopping? Just keep on playing. So that's sort of the basis of things. Eventually he talked me into going to school, and I started college at the City University of New York. And one day, and I was interested in electronic music already, but I hadn't done much of it. And I was interested in physics, and I was teaching myself math and physics and this kind of stuff. Talked me into going to school. He said I would die starving if I didn't get a degree. So I thought I would go to school. I was in my 20s already by the time I went to college, and did my undergraduate degree pretty quickly because I didn't have to take harmony and counterpoint because I had, done it with him. And one day met some composer who said, you should go talk to Charles Dodge, who ran the Computer Music Center at Brooklyn College. And I did, and that changed my life, and that's the last time I saw that person. And so from there, I learned a lot about computer programming. This is in the early 80s. And at that time, I can't see you all, so I'm just going to say, I'm sure there's some programmers among you, but at that time, not that many people knew how to program computers. And the kind of work I was doing, we had to learn how to program in the C language. And there was this crazy group of composers and musicians who know how to program in C, and Bell Labs in New Jersey needed C programmers. So some of my colleagues dropped out and ended up making a lot of money as C programmers in the early 80s. And I went interviewed at Bell Labs, and this pretty much the same week that I would have been offered a job at Bell Labs as a C programmer, I got news that I had my Fulbright to go to Italy to continue as a composer. So every chance in my life to choose ways of not making a lot of money, so sound familiar to everybody who's an artist and a musician, to choose art over that. That's just what we do, because art is everything. And it truly is, except for family. Family's first, art second. Some people, art is first. I would say for me, family's first, art is second. So there is something that's first above art for me. So went to Italy and did both, all kinds of music, including working at a computer center that was at the University of Padua, which is also where Dante spent some time, where Galileo spent some time. And so working in this 1600s palazzo on an IBM computer some days, and then working with musicians other days, because I kept on doing the computer music thing. And then from there, I went to Stanford University, where I got my doctorate. So that's sort of like a quick trajectory of going from cleaning chimneys to getting my doctorate at Stanford. And the days in living in New York and position and piano, going to college to support myself and my wife, support ourselves, both studying in interesting ways and learning a lot. We cleaned people's apartments, we took care of kids. So there's where the toilet cleaning came in. It was a way to make money without waiting tables and driving cabs and things like that. Set our own schedules and things like that. And we didn't need a lot of money to live on. So we had a little apartment in New York, which now we couldn't actually afford our own apartment in New York now if we had to buy it, But that's the way it goes. So, it is what it is. So at Stanford, I was mainly worked at the Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics. And that was one of the main centers for doing research in computation and music and composition. It was run by a composer named John Chowning, one of the most important composers of his generation. Very little music composed. He was a percussionist, and probably has like 6 or 7 pieces. He's in his late 80s. Great human being. And that place is where a lot of the things that you're using now, when you're doing your recordings and you're doing your mixing, places like the center at Stanford, there were few in the world, are where people like John and then his students like me were inventing the field that you all have to use. So if you're mixing something, we mix sound files before you could actually see them as signals on the screen. If you're doing things like stretching things in time, I'm one of the people who made that usable for everybody. I gave it away. So my colleagues and I, we just gave away software because that was sort of our culture. And some of you may know things like Max MSP and things like that. So those are all being developed there when I was there. And I was a weird composer there because I also was still playing piano and composing for choir and composing for string quartet. And some of my computer music colleagues looked at me like strangely, but there's never been an either or to me. And probably my interest in math just made it unnatural for me to also do things with computers. Somewhere along the line, I started using computers to also compose acoustic music because it never made sense to me the way composers composing, let's say, a certain kind of non-tonal music that wasn't serial, so there's no system. How do you decide what to do? And so I created algorithms, and I'll leave some time for questions about this. Created some algorithms to generate data that I could use as notes and eventually write things down by hand using that data, because you really couldn't use notation programs, although Stanford did have the first notation program that we got to use to manuscript things. And at some point, it dawned on me, very slow learner that I am, that this is exactly how composers have always composed. So it occurred to me that when Mozart is composing, I use Mozart as an example because it's so clear in Mozart. Mozart has so many, uses scales all the time to sort of expand his materials. And, I would say as a joke, do you think, like, to students when I was teaching harmony myself, do you think that Mozart would like write a C and then say, what note should I use next? I think I'll do a D. Oh God, torturing myself. I think I'll do E flat next. And then does a C minor scale. And then says, what should I do next? I think I'll do the next thing on, maybe I'll start a note lower. So as soon as you have the scale, as soon as you repeat it again on B flat, as soon as you cut it up into pieces and take pieces and move them around, you're doing algorithmic composition. This is exactly how Haydn and Mozart, Stravinsky, and Berio compose as much music as they compose. And so the idea of some kind of separation between use of technology and composing has never seemed to be an issue to me. They're the same thing, and we just use the technologies we have available. The tuning systems that were developed before Bach and really enhanced during Bach, and then Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven took full advantage of, those tuning systems are technologies. They're based on mathematics. And without high mathematics and logarithms, we wouldn't really have understood how to do all that stuff. And so, artists always use the technologies of their time. I think musicians, sometimes musicians, throughout my career, musicians have been afraid. There have been fear among musicians that, computers will put them out of business. And what I've learned is just the opposite. The more you use computers, the more you realize how valuable it is to work with individuals. And I don't think we'll ever not have that be the case. I don't think computers are and to me, not or. But because I can make pieces of electronic music that have no players, when I work with people, it's especially special. And so over my career, and maybe this I'll shift a little bit into like what inspires me. Over my career, I probably shifted in my sort of inspiration from, just the youthful, I'm a musician, I have sounds in my head, I'm just hearing music, got to get it out. Also youth from arrogance, that it's like worth getting it out, like anybody else would want to hear it. Now I'm like, why would anybody want to hear this? But when you're young, it's like, oh, everybody will want to hear this. Eventually the technology got me going, inspired me. I had ideas of sounds that couldn't be made. And I would start to create technologies, and I'd invent processing techniques, some of the ones that you're using when you do things, ways of mixing files or filtering files. And my colleagues and I would just invent whole ways of doing this with computers because we had to, because you couldn't buy anything. And then when I started working more and more with live musicians again, I realized how special it was to work with other people's bodies. And by bodies, I mean the whole, I don't think there's body, mind, and spirit. I think there's just body, but that's not like to take away the spirituality. I think the spirit is in the body. We're all just there. It's all part of ourselves. And working with those other human beings and those other bodies is what interests me most. Eventually, I've moved away from, although I still do this once in a while, I did recently, but I've moved away from even notating music and working with musicians over a long period of time to develop pieces that they know by heart in their bodies, that they play over and over again, just like regular music, except they're notated. And actually, from time to time, it's different. But if you were to hear two performances, you'd know it was the same piece, just like any piece. This is not like my original invention. It's my way of coming to it in my own way. I didn't come to it through doing Indian music or Persian music or Turkish music, but I came to it in my own way and then said, oh yeah, this sounds like what those other cultures are doing. So I understand why they came to that, to be able to do pieces that really are pieces, extended, long pieces, that the musicians and I work on together, collaborating. And that's allowed me to work with musicians from different cultures who may not even read music, but are at least as good as most musicians who can read music. They just don't have a reading music culture. And so that's allowed them and me. So a typical thing that happens doing that kind of work is I'll ask one of my colleagues. I have a group of Vietnamese musicians I've worked with over the past 10 years, quite a bit. And when we get there, say, have you ever done this before? And when one of them says, no, I don't think I ever did that before, I said, fantastic. Let's try it, and if it hurts, if it's not good, if it doesn't feel good with the body, I'll push a little bit. And if they tell me, no, this is just not going to work for us, then we'll find other ways of doing things. But that's often a starting point. And it's almost like with this people that I work with, my job is to come up with things they've never done before. But then they're doing it. I'm not telling them this is teaching them how to play their instruments. I'm suggesting ways of making sounds. So for example, a recent piece I did with one of my colleagues who plays, she's one of the best dantron players in the world. And the dantron is a zither like a koto or a guzheng. That's Chinese and the Chinese bass version of that and the Japanese version. It's a 19-string zither. And it's played with, you pluck the strings and you bend the strings, and it's got a bunch of bridges. And I wanted her to play it with the left hand like a guitar, so that she was actually stopping the strings and making different pitches. And this was so hard to do. But I came back and we said, okay, that's not going to work. 2 days later, we got back together and she had been practicing it. And she's playing, and the piece actually is using commercial software called Guitar Rig. And we made a blues guitar piece for the dantron. And that's one of my more recent pieces. But I'm also, working I did pieces with the Seattle Symphony and things like that too. So that's more or less, that's a start. That's probably more than you need to know. But I'll leave it at that for now and see where Tim wants to take this.
Oh, it was awesome. That's awesome. And we've talked briefly in the halls through the years. And again, I'm struck in a certain way about how similar our lives were when we were young. We had a coal-fired furnace, and one of my 10,000 jobs in the dairy farm was to fill that furnace every day. And I frequently get covered with coal dust. And Jethro Tull, who I will always adore. I saw him a couple times when I was a kid. I loved that band, still love that band.
Yeah, Thick as a Brick is a masterpiece.
I saw him do that live. It was amazing in Chicago, which is really great. So you mentioned kind of briefly in the cracks there, I thought it was interesting about the fact that there is a camp of composers who believe that humans are sort of passé. And it was kind of comforting to hear you talk about the integration of the two, as well as for purposes of this project that we're in, this voyage that we're on, the notion of notated music and just ordering sounds and going with what you hear, and a lot more kind of organic. I thought that was super awesome. Thank you for that a lot. So, we're in the midst of a thing as a society, a global society. And I'm sure now that, we've been doing this for 2 months, obviously you've been chased pretty hard by so many details as a director of a unit, but I'm sure that you've had thoughts about what does this mean for the future? And what does this mean for what you do as an artist? And what kind of early thoughts are you having about all this? Because I do think it's a sea change. I don't think we're going to come back from this the same. There's no way. So what are your thoughts that way? Well,
it may be, I don't think I'm fooling myself in thinking a couple of things. One is, and we're doing a faculty search in VX Arts, and for your students, that's another department that I'm part of. And we had to finish the search just online. And in doing it, and doing this kind of thing, it seems so normal. And I realized, I was at the 1964 World's Fair in New York, where they had the vidiphones or whatever they were at the Bell Labs pavilion. And I feel like to some extent, we've been expecting this for our whole lives. And so that's one reason why it feels so natural, even to us older people, is that it's been on our radar in science fiction and in movies and in hopes and desires. And yet the thing that feels so strange about it is how unstrange it feels to be talking to you. I'm seeing you, Tim, I'm seeing your students. And then when I'm meeting with my students, I want to point at something or someone says something really, one of the students says something especially, wonderful. And I want to say, yes, but I realize I'm just pointing it to nowhere. I could be smiling at anybody, and you realize how strange it really is to be here. So that's one thing. I mean, I think that this is normal, but it's not normal. And I think the strangeness of it is that actually we are coping with it, and that's bound to change us. For music, I think that the way this is going to change us to some extent, at least for a while, I don't think for a long time, but I think this has been happening anyway, is that on the professional music domain, I think that for universities, I think large ensembles are really, really important, and people will still be doing this. But I think professionally, we've been moving, I think, as a society more towards a chamber music kind of modality. That's partly economics. It's what happened after the First World War, when Stravinsky went from writing the Rite of Spring to L'Histoire du Soldat. It was about who's available and how much money do you have for an orchestra. So I think we've been moving in that direction, and this will further that, because the kind of work I do, I can do with my colleagues because we're small numbers. I tend to not work, and most of my colleagues tend to not work with large orchestras. One of the problems of doing modern music, like contemporary music, is just what people do when it's modern. So it could have been Beethoven was writing contemporary music. And to me, Beethoven was an experimental composer. Is that these days, because of economies, orchestras don't spend time rehearsing. Even pianists don't spend time rehearsing new pieces. And so you really can't be radical and experimental in the way that Beethoven was if you're working with large groups of people. And so to move the art form, I wouldn't say forward, but because it doesn't mean it's better, it's just what we do as artists is to investigate. I'm doing that with smaller groups of people is how we've been doing it anyway, and I think this will solidify that. And for some of us, I've been doing, because we've been international, I've been doing rehearsals with Skype and other kinds of video conferencing. My Vietnamese colleagues live part of the year in Hanoi, part of the year in Stockholm. So sometimes we meet in Stockholm because it's sort of halfway between the two, but when we can't, we end up working together this way for part of it, because it usually takes a year or more to do a piece together. So I think it's part of it. I'm doing a PhD seminar in digital arts right now, and I had planned in November to use Zoom before I knew anything. I thought, okay, because we were starting to have Zoom meetings, I thought we'll use Zoom. And we had the students in that are working just like your students are working on a creative project. The assignment for them is that it's the kind of project that can only be done, and it's going to be a performance that could only happen if they're in remote outposts from each other. You can't do this work any other way. So that's their challenge. What is this instrument? And what are the properties of this instrument? Look at it as an instrument. And I think, who knows how this is going to, who knows? I mean, that's the real answer. But it certainly is changing all of how we think about each other and about people. I'm hoping that people being afraid of each other on the street will go away after a while, because I like the fact that people are more polite. And when I'm walking down a sidewalk where two people can walk at one time adjacently, and people don't move single file, and I have to move out of their way, and now they move out of each other's way. I like that, but I rather them do it for politeness, not because they're afraid of each other. Anyway, so I think the main thing is that these kinds of changes, I think that the economic problems are going to be severe, and I'm concerned about our students. I'll say this out loud because no one's going to care what I say. I want Bill Gates to give the University of Washington $1 billion for one thing, to keep instruction for our students going. I don't want to go to anybody else. I just want somebody with $1 billion to say, we will make it possible to keep on teaching the kids. And you can include kindergarten through undergraduate. And graduates are important too, but people could take some time off. I took time off. But I'm hoping that that will help a little, that something like that could help.
Yeah, I think I like to sort of cull from what everybody says and find connection points and similar themes. And one thing that you're saying that has been a part of several of our guests, which is true, two things. One is that the action before all this happened, the action was in chamber music. I've felt for 20 years that that's the most interesting music that's being written, the most interesting groups that have been formed, the most interesting ways of presenting the music, even on YouTube and stuff like that, the most creative. And that's all part and parcel of the economic situation. The fact, as you mentioned, that the symphony orchestras aren't flexible in terms of being able to take something that you or some contemporary composer has written and really master the extended techniques required and whatnot. They get their hour-and-a-half rehearsal and then they're going to play it. And John Corigliano wrote the foreword of my third book, and he just goes off about that in there. And that's one reason why he was attracted right for wind ensemble, because he said these college folks, they're going to take the music and they're going to rehearse it and get it right. You know, even though they don't play at that high level, just the repetition will get it.
Just the repetition, exactly.
And you need to do that, so that the game was changed long before this, and it just strikes me that this has just accelerated it all. And so one of the things a number of the guests have said to the students is, you know, get creative, get entrepreneurial about these things as you go forward, and don't lose track of the fact that you're going to have all kinds of need to be really facile and really, you know, you got to make all this software that you're currently working with sort of disappear. Kind of the way that Microsoft Word has disappeared for all of us, you know, or the iPhone or whatever. It's got to be that fluid in your life.
And it almost doesn't matter, you know, where you live, where your home is. You know, I do a lot of work with the Jack String Quartet, and they're not as young as they were, but they're still younger than you and me, Tim. And they came out of Eastman and started their own group. And I think they're a 501c3, which they're a nonprofit. You know, they raise money and they do workshops. But they decided they were going to do this, and they were going to have a career and raise the funds and do things. And then my colleagues from Vietnam, they teach at the Hanoi Conservatory. They're traditional musicians, but they have this other European style, because they want to, experimental music that they bring back to Hanoi. And they're getting known all over Asia for being the people who can, you know, almost play with anybody, small groups, because they have this variety of music that they can play, small group, different kind of groups. What you said about the practice, Tim, it reminds me. So, and it's also the same thing with this group of musicians from Vietnam. I got a commission to do a piece with the Seattle Symphony some years ago. This trio of musicians with the symphony, and I decided to do just strings, given their instruments. And then I decided I would do 19 strings because that's what the piece was, and these instruments, and they're 19 individual parts. And stupid me, I thought, okay, great. You know, here's a commission, it's orchestra, 19 individual parts. And Elena Dubinets calls me up and says, there's a trouble, you know, with the money, because they're all soloists because there were 19 individual parts. And they, you know, so, you know, there's issues there that, you know, being just, you know, a composer and thinking, you know, eventually it worked out, you know, and I think maybe because they understood why the piece had to be 19 individual parts. Here comes my old counterpoint studies with my Romanian teacher at play, thinking that I'm going to do a piece that has 19 individual parts, a triple concerto with 19 different parts going on at the same time. Right. That's my Josquin, you know, counterpoint. going mad.
And you just thought, what can possibly go wrong?
Exactly. It's just strings. I'm making it simple. Right? It's just.
That's a great story. You should put that on a plaque in your book. That's too good.
It's a memorable moment.
For real. So so tell us, you wanted to talk about algorithms, and I think that's really interesting, the way to describe classic composers and and the fact that they were writing algorithms. Let's run down that path a little bit. Talk about that.
So I program in a variety of different languages for a variety, you know, that I've come across that are useful to me. One of them is called the Lisp programming language. And it's let me see if I can explain the way I work with them. It's different, you know, it's similar, but different than classical music. Well, here, I'll start with this. I have a piece for viola, and a lot of my pieces include live electronics, or I mean, the old days would be tape. My piece for viola, and I was watching this movie, Pi. It was probably almost 20 years ago. I can't remember when this movie Pi was. It was in the early 2000s. And some nerd was trying to, think about how, is there a pattern? Is there a pattern to pi? How many points of pi do you have to go before you find out there's a pattern? And they're doing all this mathematical stuff and they're running computers. And I said, these people don't know what they're talking about. They just need to listen to it because our ears pick up pattern. So I entered a bunch of, because the computer can calculate pi out, thousands of numbers on the other side of the decimal point. And I used numbers, and because we have just numbers 0 through 9, right? So those are the numbers that are available. And so there was 10 notes. And so I left out a couple of notes. So I used 10 different notes and assigned just assign one note to every number. So A was 1, A flat's 2, blah, 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 like that. And then I listened to it and I didn't hear any patterns, but I heard riffs that just randomly came out. So I ended up using that data and using algorithms that could find the riffs based on certain criteria, I would say. Like if you have a certain kind of presence of a certain number of notes, those and leave out the others. Or transpose those to another range. That's pretty simple. This is kind of basic stuff that I might do, but it's sort of like data processing. It's not that different for any of your students who are in the sciences also, to how astronomers use computer algorithms to identify patterns of stars and patterns of light, and then to try to understand them. So part of it is to actually analyze data to see what's in it. So it could be, I could actually be taking a piece of music by Chopin and finding out some things about the music that I want to extract. So that's one part. Another way of using algorithms is simply to create some rules. But I'll say that I'm having a hard time actually describing it without showing the music. I've always been an improviser since I was a kid, for whatever reason. And by becoming pretty fluent as a programmer, I really used the computer to generate a lot of material really quickly that I could listen to, based on some rules, based on some ideas. So let's go to the Mozart. It could be, pick notes that are, among these notes, pick notes that overemphasize this or that note, but otherwise are random. Listen to that. Okay, that sounds terrible. Now do that, but keep on repeating one note every so often. Okay, do that, listen to it. Because one of the things that associated with using computers to compose that I also realized is, and this, if you think about Haydn composing all those string quartets, inventing the form, there's no possible way that he wrote down the string quartet and said, oh, that's good. So Haydn had musicians available who he was working with, and he played too, and he obviously had to write something down. He'd listen to it. He'd either have to make changes or the next one he'd get better. And one of the things that attracted me to using computers to generate sound and generate notes I could listen to by writing algorithms that would generate the music is that I could hear it. And I could make decisions about whether I thought it was good or not. Because I couldn't get musicians, because none of us can get musicians of a certain quality to do these repetitions over and over and over again, so that you can make the changes. So I had to invent my own string quartet that I could learn from. So, and I have to say, one of my critiques of a lot of my, I wouldn't say even colleagues, but composers around the world is I think I can tell the ones who don't listen to their own music, who look at their scores and say, oh, that looks great. And I've had many, many students, who are writing music down, the old-fashioned way, know that they're not listening to it even in real time. They're just looking at the score and going, turning the pages. And I say, how long is that piece? I don't really know how long it is. how could you not know how long your own piece is? So I think the use of the algorithms is really, I use it to generate lots and lots of materials faster than I could do with my own brain. And this is why, I think about astronomers. Astronomers are doing things that probably millions of brains could get together and do, but it would take a really long time. And they use computers to do it because computers do these rote calculations that are probably good for, your brain in terms of, not getting brain diseases and things like that, but they're not good for art, to be spending so much of your time calculating numbers. You just got, because you have to produce a lot of art, in order to get good at it. It's a practice thing, just like anything else. So that's, I think that I've used similar kinds of algorithms for a long time, and sometimes I'll base the input to the algorithms. I'll just take some Bach, or I'll take some Chopin, or I'll take something else, and I'll start to use that as the input and make some changes to what's going on in that music and see what happens with it. And by the time it's done, and this happened with the sequence of pi numbers, it's the original source is not there anymore. It's sort of like sculpting with this data, but it gets me started, and it makes it so I don't face the blank page. And I'm not writing tonal music, so I'm not writing tunes, but I love harmony. I love tunes, but I'm not going to write music that sounds like Beethoven or that kind of tuneful music, because I'm not. And so just the amount of work it takes to scan the possibilities, to find something worth exploring. And then, most importantly, I have to say, is worth asking someone to sit and listen to, because I always have the audience in my mind. I'm not writing to an audience, but I am, because I'm always conscious of, why should anybody listen to this? Why not just improvise at home on the piano and call it a day? So it's looking for things that are worth sharing with other people, and using algorithms and using computers to do that speeds up the process and gives me more information than I would otherwise have. So it's basically that. And then anybody who knows computer programming can understand algorithms, and anybody who doesn't can think about the art example or the fugue example, recipes. So we all learn how to write fugues. When it's not that way anymore, but to get a degree at Stanford, when I was there, there was one of the composers there liked to terrorize this, even to the last day of being a doctoral student, and you had to write a fugue to get out of there. And so one of my colleagues, he was from Poland and went to a conservatory in Krakow, and he was really like flexing his muscles, and he wrote a double fugue. And what I did, and I shouldn't say this in front of the students, I wrote my goal was to write the most correct, boring fugue that he couldn't say anything was wrong with as I could. So that was done by recipe. But the real fugues, the ones we'd love to listen to, the ones that are in Bach or late Beethoven, those start with the recipe, and then they algorithmically stretch and move and put upside down and inside out and change notes, over time.
But I think it's really practical the way you compose in a certain way. That's what strikes me, that it's kind of like there's a gold mine, there's a lot of gold down there. So you just go dig as much as you possibly can. You don't worry about fashioning it into some vase or something. You just pull it all up at the front of the mine and then just look at it. I think that's terrific. I have kind of a layman's question I want to ask you that I've been wondering about the last 20 years or so. I feel like since the invention of Sibelius and finale, and this is a little bit too much of a generalization, but at least in my art and my idiom, I feel like music composition has become a little bit less creative. And I wonder if that's a function of sort of
Hey, Tim, you're breaking up. You just repeat that last bit.
Yeah, sorry. I'm going to go off screen.
Yeah, okay.
Because that helps sometimes.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think that finale and Sibelius, because of the copy paste function, that music isn't quite as creative or as interesting as it used to be, especially like in development sections and stuff like that. And like the A, when it comes back as an A, is a straight A, because people Do you think there's something about pen to paper that's more intellectually probing or something like that? Or am I just
No, I think you're right. I
wrong?
mean, I have to say that I use algorithms like pen to paper, um, because because I'm not copying and pasting, and because I can improvise with it. And so, but I think you're onto something with the Sibelius and Finale. I agree that the copy and paste is part of the problem, but I think the real problem is that it makes so many assumptions about what music notation is, and ignores a lot of the 20th century. And it also ignores other cultures that don't use measures and don't use the kind of beat forms and metrics. So I think to some extent, I think there's a whole range of reasons why it's problematic. I think computers are problematic. When I was a younger composer doing things with computers, I was concerned that the advent of MIDI instruments and things like that would make it too easy for for people to make music that wasn't good, because up until then it was actually hard even to make bad music. So because you at least had to be able to play something and be able to just do things very, very quickly. And I think to some extent that's happened. I'll have to say, and this is for students and for all of us, I think everybody should make music, and it shouldn't matter whether it's good, whether it's not good, whether it's innovative or it's not innovative. The issue is if you're making art, it's like being a scientist or like being a medical doctor. I think you have a different responsibility to all the great artists whose work you're stealing. And so you have a responsibility to not do it as an amateur, but there's no problem with doing it as an amateur. It's great. Everybody should do it for their friends, for each other, for themselves. They should do all that kind of music. But the thing that Finale, I can't use Finale and Sibelius for most of what I do. And I think actually it's probably one of the things that led me to stop notating music. So I'm grateful maybe because when I was at Stanford, so there's a composer, the composer who terrorized me with the fugues, his name is Leland Smith. And Leland Smith was the inventor of the score program. And at Stanford, he was finishing working on it. It was called MS, like manuscript. And it was the first one in the world to do this, high quality typesetting. We had this humongous laser printer that printed out like huge, huge sheets of paper. And I think I did my first piece using that program in like 1986. There were no commercial products available at that time. They were a few years away. And his program, Score, eventually came out. And that was the professional typesetting program that Schott and other kinds of, and Universal would use. And he was consulting with them. And it's very, very difficult to use. But the program was a graphics program, and you could use it. It had all the about standard music that Finale have, but it also was just a graphics program, and you could make up shape, have no measure, make sounds and notes. There were no kludges that you had to do in order to get around it, and so I think the problem is that for artists who don't want to, or are not writing music for standard ensembles, is that these programs are really, really difficult to do anything different in notation. But they're great if you're an arranger and if you're arranging, you're doing studio work and you're arranging for an orchestra to do a film score, you'd be grateful for Sibelius cut and paste, because, you probably have a week to get 2 hours of music done or something like that. And I don't have to listen to it, so I don't mind that it's done. I have a choice if I don't want to listen to that music. You're muted, Tim, by the way.
I know. I'm just trying to figure out what's going on with my bandwidth. Sorry about that.
Oh, I know what's going on. You have your whole families on at the same time,
yes,
right?
Exactly, and they're all on the side of the house.
So this is one of the also artifacts of life, is that so many people have their whole families are on Zoom at the same time, and the wireless at the same time. So I know some people who are have Zoom schedules at home.
Yeah, it's kind of come to that. Yeah, it's just amazing.
Yeah.
And giving lessons, taking lessons, on and on. It's wild. But this is the life.
So for doctoral, just finally, so back to this issue, because it's a big one for me. Doctoral students or graduate students, or even undergraduates, I haven't had any in a while in composition. If they're writing music that adheres to Sibelius and Finale, I'm not going to be happy. And if they can't get it done with Sibelius and Finale, pen to paper. Absolutely.
Yeah, I just say one more thing about that, not to bore everybody, but the other thing I notice is there isn't accommodation for the instruments in their individualistic capabilities, that they're mass editing everything.
Yeah.
And so there's just inherent balance problems. I feel like I spend most of my day trying to reorder that when we're in rehearsal and stuff. And again, I think the technology has made that easier, and it's pushed that thoughtful process, which is super duper important, to this tiny little window at the very end of everything. And they're just doing, again, the mass forte or the mass piano or whatever it is. And it bugs me.
Well, you hear this, I think, in film music. You know, we've been, just because we're looking for things to we use the Seattle Library a lot for, we like to see classic art films, and the Seattle Library has a good collection. So for all of your students, you could get great movies in Seattle Library when they're open again. So we've been watching some old TV stuff that we've either found online or whatever. I won't say what, but there's an evening, like an evening, so 1980s. And on one of these, the music is amazing. And it's exactly what you're talking about, Tim. It's like every little, it's like things, I keep on hearing things say, that's completely unnecessary for that composer to have done. That color, that individual, that oboe coming out, or what, you know, but such pride in the work. His name is Peter Myers. I looked him up. He just, you know, that's what he did. He did these little short, little tiny things for these shows. And there's such detail, exquisite detail of what instrument is playing what, and what the sound of that instrument and the ranges of the instruments. Yeah.
Right. I just watched, well, we could talk forever, but I want to get to this. But just one more thing. I was watching Hans Zimmer do this roundtable discussion. He wrote Dunkirk. I don't know if you got to see Dunkirk, but
No.
I kind of admire the score. I think it's interesting, kind of a cool combination of Elgar and electronica, like throughout. And he was talking about having like 40 string bass players in the session, and 8 horn players up in the one balcony and 8 in the other balcony, and just the kind of stuff they're doing. And then of course that all gets processed to death. And so by the time you hear it, it could never be replicated live, never.
Right.
But it makes for a pretty interesting cinema. Well, anyhow, we want to give the students a chance to ask questions, you guys. You've got somebody here who's had a fascinating life, as you can tell. And it is highly, highly experimental and groundbreaking and interesting. So Corey, I think you're moderating the questions. Is that true enough?
Yep, that's right.
Awesome. Can you forward anything you have?
Sure. I have 2 questions right now, and anybody else, if you have questions, feel free to direct message me. These first 2 I'll ask on their behalf. The first one, how would you say that your interest in classical music and rock and roll has influenced your composition?
That's a really easy question to answer, and a really hard, I hate to be, you know, it's like to give that kind of an answer, but the easy answer is that if you, I would say that even the music I probably think is bad music. You know, there's some bad pop music I listened to when I was a kid, and even that influenced me. So, you know, on the basic level, things I was listening to a lot and that I liked a lot got under my skin. And I was listening to rock music and pop music and classical music. And I think one of the things that, for whatever reason, I remember talking to, when I finally was in school and I was meeting other composers, more composers, and we were all going through school together. And I remember being at a conference where a bunch of composers were complaining that they were told by their teachers that they shouldn't really be listening to rock and pop music anymore. They shouldn't like that. They shouldn't influence their music. And that they had to be taught to like Xenakis. So if you don't know, everybody knows Xenakis. Xenakis is this like very experimental noise composer. And I was like, no one had to like teach me to like Xenakis, because I thought Xenakis was like Beethoven. And I could still listen to Led Zeppelin if I want to. So why are you listening to your teachers tell you not to do something? You have to, you know, if you're in school, you have to have a good reason to not do what your teachers ask you to do. But it doesn't mean you can't do other things as well. And so I think that I just, I figured just intuitively at a younger age, this was good music. Now I listen to Led Zeppelin, And for just how I think about them, because I still listen to it, and it's amazing music. But think about the difference between, who's ever favorite classical composer and how they developed, if they lived long enough to develop, and how Led Zeppelin, a group like Led Zeppelin, didn't continue to develop. So what's the difference? I think this is important for students to understand. At least this is my theory. For you all, you could say I'm right. So I know I'm right about this, but I'll call it a theory to be polite. So if I listen to my music that I composed when I was in my 20s, I don't know how I even did that. There's some good stuff there still. A couple of things from my 20s still get played. And I don't remember even knowing how I could compose music like that. So there's something that happens when you're younger, and whatever talent is or whatever hard work is, there's a well there that if you work hard enough, you tap it. This happens in the sciences too. But for a lot of rock groups who didn't actually study something formally beyond the music they play, right? Because I don't compose like Bach. I studied a lot of Bach. Something, eventually that well runs dry. And it happens somewhere along the line in transition from the stuff that you do intuitively with your youthful well into a kind of lifelong thoughtful process. And so now, so I think that the drive and the youthful experimentation of the rock music is there, because I think that's a seed, that's a foundation that I value. And it influenced my so-called classical music composing by wanting to find a way of doing what they do, the rock musicians, but furthering it and developing and not stopping. And I'm still listening to Led Zeppelin from the 1970s. I'm not listening to that much Jimmy Page now. So I don't know if that's a good answer, but that's the best I can come up with.
No, I think that's awesome. We have a lot in common about the 70s. Do you know, so it's just between you and I, just a second here, kids. Do you know Gentle Giant?
I remember that name, but I don't remember the music.
Oh, it's unbelievable, Richard. I'll send it to you.
Oh, good.
One other thing I want to say before we take a student question is, you're talking about the presence of piano and how a piano in the house back in those days was a thing.
Yeah.
Everybody had a piano in their house.
Yeah.
And that has declined radically across the United States. I read recently that during World War II, about 2 weeks after D-Day, they dropped pianos from airplanes in parachutes all over the place to the troops because all these guys played the piano.
Yeah.
It's just astounding to me. Upright pianos, bam, in the middle of the town square. Those were the days.
Yeah.
Oh, Aaron Butler, Gentle Giant is great. Aaron, you get a 4.0 this quarter. It's going. Okay, Corey, another question for Dr. Karpen.
Let's see. This one asks, you've brought up alternative ways scientists look at data. They also use citizen scientists to help collect more data than they can get themselves. Do you see a future for a similar use of citizen musicians, such as community bands and ensembles, for music development?
What a great question. Can I know who asked that question?
Her name is Stacy.
Okay, nice question, Stacy. I'm going to give that a little bit of thought and try to talk and think at the same time.
Sure.
So
if you'd like me to just say hi, I know my connection might fuzz out.
Hi.
I'm actually one of the community members of one of the bands, so I'm an alumna of UW, and I've just continued to play with the concert band. Yeah,
that's great. That's great. So, well, then I'm completely against community music being involved, anything like that. So this is what I'd say. I have kind of a historic, answer to this, because one of the things I was interested in as a composer when I was younger, now, still interested, but it interested me, was the advent of opera and where that came from. First of all, this is not related to your really good question, but one of the founders of the opera was a father. So there's that art science connection all the way back. Galileo was one of the Florentine Camerata composers, is Galileo's father. And they were looking to do something like what they thought the Greeks were doing, but really what they were doing was drawing from Italian so-called vernacular music and what was in the air and the singing of songs. And so much of the great music we have that came through that time to Monteverdi and skipped forward to Vivaldi, and then of course Bach stealing all the Vivaldi, has to have derived from community musicians with guitars and lutes, singing, playing, what we might call folk music, but I wouldn't. I would just call it music. And so when I'm I'll just tell you my feelings. When I'm working with my Vietnamese colleagues, they're drawing not only from the Vietnamese classical tradition, but from Vietnamese folk theater traditions. And for whatever reason, I think it's deep in our human bodies, all of us, I tend to gravitate towards these folk melodies that they'll play or sing, and want to use that. And they laugh at me because, oh, you like these, you like the, this is a very famous tune in Vietnam. I have no idea. It just makes me cry, right? Because it's so beautiful. So I think that on that level of the kind of music that, let's say, the word amateur, by the way, for all of you, comes from, it's from Latin, but amateur is a French word that means lover, means you love something. And I know this because when I was living in France, I went to a cheese place where they were selling all these goat cheeses of different ages. The young ones, which were all clean and white, and then they got moldier and moldier and moldier until they were these little crusty things. And the really crusty, dark, hard things were called, it said, pour les amateurs. And I said, what, first thing, I spoke French, but I was saying amateurs? What, amateur? No, for people who really love cheese. So this is my long-winded way of saying that I think that it's a hugely important source of sort of like what we are as human beings, that people make music. And if you're ignoring the music people make, then I don't know, it seems hard to imagine that you're making music that anybody should listen to. So keep it up.
Thank you. Thank you for answering the question.
Yeah.
Corey, any more?
Yeah, Oliver, if you would like to ask your question.
Sure, yeah. My question was going to be about the Harry Partch Instrumentarium. And we started hosting them in 2014. And if anybody doesn't know, it's a really cool bunch of instruments that he created, and he was a really innovative composer. I'm wondering what sorts of inspiration have you taken from him, and what you see as the impact of having them hosted by us on the composition department?
What another great question. So I first heard the music of Harry Partch. There was an LP called The World of Harry Partch that came out in 1972, and I think I probably heard it in 1973 when I was 17, I guess. Something like that, 73, I can't remember. Anyway, teenager. And no, younger than that, but it doesn't matter. So, and for anybody who doesn't know, all of the students here don't know Harry Partch, P-A-R-T-C-H. He really is one of the most important American musicians and composers of all time. He had a theory of music that used tunings from the Greeks. And so, for example, he had a 43-tone octave. It was called just intonation. It's something that's been known for a long time. Bach played with just intonation himself. And Harry Partch built all his own instruments. And now when I hear his music, it sounds like classical music to me. When I heard his music, it got into me right away. It just went right in, mainlining for whatever reason. And that's also one of the musics I listened to over and over and over again when I wasn't listening to Led Zeppelin and Rachmaninoff. I'll do the personal thing, and then I'll talk about the other stuff, because Harry Partch, when I started doing music with computers and making sounds with computers, the very, very first thing I tried to synthesize was the sound of one of his zithers. So just strumming the zither is a very particular kind of sound in Harry Partch's music. And I never could do it. It was one of those lessons like going to Betsy Jolas' harmony class in Paris and realizing I didn't know anything because I couldn't understand anything. And I realized, okay, you know, my lifelong, you know, quest is going to be to make those sounds. And then we had the opportunity to bring the Harry Partch Ensemble here. I won't go into the details of how that happened for a concert. They shipped all the instruments here. And I got to play with the instruments. And I understood the genius involved in making the instruments. So if you play the zither, and they're not around anymore here, but if you ever get a chance to like just strum one of these, there's no reason it sounds that way. It's just wood and piano string, piano wire over holes in a box. It sounds like it's, without making the frequencies or the pitches really, really low, it sounds like an instrument that a giant, you know, 100 feet tall would play. It's so resonant. It's so amazing. It's so complex. I still don't understand it. I mean, you'd have to be, you know, it's like people have spent their lives, physicists have spent their lives analyzing Stradivarius violins. So there's some, whatever the materials and the instruments we had were the original materials. He built these instruments we had. I think that I think that the presence of the instruments had a big effect on a lot of the students beyond the composition. I think a lot of our student musicians got to play them and got to learn how to play them. I know that Bonnie had her students playing with them, and it's a very different experience listening to that music recordings, which I find beautiful, and actually being with them and playing them, and it's a physical response that's very different. It's not like playing a vibraphone isn't a great physical experience, but playing Harry Partch's instruments is something otherworldly. And so the instruments themselves are works of art, I think, and all works of art are unexplainable. So I'll use this as a riff to say, one of the mean things I used to do to my composition students, I might do this once in a while to one of my digital art students who deserve this question. When they're having a problem writing good music, I would say, well, name a great piece of music. And say, okay, whatever it is, you know, the Beethoven Eroica, or it could be, you know, La Mer or something like that. Whatever it is, they name a great piece of music. And I say, well, okay, so you know what great music is. How come you can't write it? Because there's no recipe. And so that's what it is with Harry Partch's instruments. It's the presence of being with these instruments for which there's no recipe. You can replicate them, and they have been. There's a German group that has replicas of all the instruments, and I haven't heard them live, but everybody tells me they sound great, but they don't sound like magic. So I think that's what it is about being with Harry Partch's instruments, is the instruments themselves are works of art that you're playing. That's different than playing a trumpet, that, you know, great Yamaha trumpet, but it's just another Yamaha trumpet compared to Harry Partch's handmade instruments that have passed down through generations now.
Awesome. Awesome. Good question, Oliver. Any more, Corey?
Yeah, it looks like we have one more. Let's see. Did you ever encounter conflict when trying to combine your computer science and music interests into one career? And if so, how did you manage that conflict?
All the time. You know, I'm not a computer scientist. I'm a musician. And so I never have had a problem with computer scientists understanding I'm not a computer scientist. But sometimes I've had problems with musicians thinking that maybe I'm a computer person and not a composer. And that's just it probably, you know, I don't even think it bothered me when I was a young person. I think I took it on as a challenge. Maybe I took it on as sort of a badge of honor. Now, I think we're in a different place. And I think that mostly people understand, you know, that in fact, I have one of our current students, I won't say who, one of our current students was talking about how my colleague Juan Pampin, another composer, and I do both things. And I said, both things? There's not both. And I actually went through my Mozart analogy with both things. It's like imagining that Rembrandt was a painter and a paint maker. We don't think that Rembrandt was a paint maker. We know he was a painter, and at that time, painters made their paints. And so that's how I view the stuff with computer science, and that's what I've tried to explain to people. But sure, there's a lot of misunderstanding among my generation of musicians. I had arguments with my faculty at Stanford who were not part of the computer music, an early music guy who's on my graduate committee, who, when he found I have a flute piece that he loved the flute piece, and it won awards. It won the National Flute Association Flute Contest Award. And when he found out that I used algorithms to compose it, he screamed at me, "How dare you make people listen to music that you didn't write every note?" Maybe now that I think about it, maybe it was him that made me think about the Mozart analogy. This was in the 80s. He was actually a great guy, and actually I wrote a piece for his choir that didn't have, that I didn't use the computer to do. But I think, things like that happen, and I think there's just a misunderstanding that somehow using computers was not human. And I always try to explain that using a hammer, if you're building, a beautiful bookcase or a beautiful table, the hammer is just a tool.
Well, this has sure been great. And what strikes me about, especially what you're saying right here at the end, is that a computer for you is very much like Harry Partridge's instruments were for him.
Yep.
And that you've managed to make a really magical computer, to use your term, the way you described the original Partridge instrument.
Yeah, absolutely, Tim.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the art is, if the art's not there, then who cares?
Right.
Right. I would say another thing that used to happen with students when my students were writing 12-tone music is the music was kind of boring. We were talking about it, and they'd start to talk to me about how great the tone row was, or their manipulations of the row, and I'd say, okay, that's nice, but the music sounds bad. So I think I think we all share the same values. We might like different music, but I think what we're all after is this magical, spiritual, unexplainable experience.
Totally. We're all trying to get to beauty, and there's a bunch of roads. That's for sure. That's for sure. Well, everybody, turn off your sound muting, and let's thank Professor Karpen for being here.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Tim, for inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity to meet with your students.
This is great, and I'm going to send you a couple of things they've been up to. You remember when we were first talking about this, and you said to me, we agreed, they're going to be a lot more hip to all this software than we ever would have dreamed when we were that age. And guess what? I mean, for sure, it's just crazy. I'll send you some stuff. It's mind blowing. It's actually,
as you're going back to the very beginning, I mean, about the changes, it'd be hard for you to teach this class this quarter if they didn't know how to do that stuff.
That's right. That's right. Chris has made some beautiful tutorials, but even so.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you too.